It started innocently enough, like any other New Year's Eve. The snow fell in thick, lazy flakes, and the streetlights outside my apartment flickered as the icy wind howled. I had planned to spend the night alone, maybe watch a movie, sip some whiskey, and call it a year. But fate had other plans. My friend Jake called around 8 p.m. "You can't spend New Year's Eve cooped up," he said, his voice muffled by the sound of music and chatter in the background. "There's a party at this old manor just outside the city. Exclusive invite. You in?" I should have said no. Something about the way he said exclusive made my skin crawl, but maybe it was the thought of starting the new year with a hint of adventure that convinced me otherwise. By 9 p.m., I was in my car, heading out to a location Jake had texted me. The manor was straight out of a gothic horror novel. Its towering silhouette loomed against the starless sky, its windows dark except for the occasional flicker of candlelight. Cars lined the snow-covered driveway, their polished surfaces reflecting the faint glow of lanterns hanging from the trees. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of mulled wine and burning wood. Guests in formal attire milled about, their laughter echoing off the high ceilings. Jake greeted me with a wide grin and a glass of champagne. "Isn't this place wild?" he said, gesturing to the grand chandelier overhead. It was wild, but not in the way he meant. There was something off about the party. The guests all seemed too perfect. Their smiles were a little too wide, their eyes a little too bright. And then there was the host. I spotted him from across the room. He was tall, with slicked back hair and a sharp black suit. He moved through the crowd like a shark through water, his presence commanding yet unnerving. When his eyes met mine, a chill ran down my spine. "You must be Alex," he said when he approached me, his voice smooth as silk. I hadn't told anyone my name. "Welcome to my humble abode. I'm Victor." His handshake was cold, his grip firm. I tried to play it off, chalking up my unease to the whiskey I'd had before leaving my apartment. But as the night wore on, things only got stranger. At midnight, Victor announced a special toast in the grand dining hall. We all gathered around a long table draped in crimson velvet. Goblets of dark red wine were placed before us, the liquid inside shimmering like molten rubies. Victor raised his glass, his smile sharp enough to cut glass. "To new beginnings," he said, his voice carrying a weight that made the room fall silent. We drank, and that's when everything went wrong. The wine was bitter, metallic. As soon as it touched my lips, the room spun. I blinked, and the warm glow of the chandeliers was replaced by flickering shadows. The guests' laughter turned to whispers, then screams. When I looked down, the goblet in my hand was no longer filled with wine, but with something thick and dark, like ink. Panic set in. I stumbled back, but the room seemed to stretch and warp around me. Faces melted into grotesque masks, their perfect smiles splitting open to reveal rows of jagged teeth. Victor stood at the head of the table, unchanged, his eyes gleaming with something ancient and malevolent. "The night demands a sacrifice," he said, his voice booming. "And you, Alex, are the guest of honor." I bolted, pushing past the shifting, clawing figures. The walls of the manor groaned, as if alive, closing in around me. The once grand staircase twisted like a serpent, leading me deeper into darkness. Somewhere behind me, I heard Victor's laughter, cold and relentless. I don't know how I found the exit. One moment, I was stumbling through a corridor that seemed endless. The next, I was outside, the icy wind biting at my skin. The manor stood silent and still, its windows dark once more. There were no cars, no guests, no sign of the nightmare I had just escaped. When I reached my car, I found a note tucked under the windshield wiper. It was written in elegant looping script. "You've been chosen. Until next year, Alex." I didn't sleep that night, and I haven't celebrated New Year's Eve since. But every December 31st, as the clock inches closer to midnight, I feel it. A pull, a whisper at the edge of my consciousness. And somewhere I know Victor is waiting. It was New Year's Eve, and I was stuck at work, watching the clock tick towards midnight. The office was dead quiet, with only the hum of the heating system breaking the silence. My coworkers had all left hours ago, their laughter and party plans fading into the cold night. But I had a report due by morning, so there I was, alone in a dimly lit building with only my thoughts for company. At around 10 p.m., the first strange thing happened. My phone buzzed with a notification, an incoming call from an unknown number. Normally I'd ignore it, but something compelled me to answer. On the other end was a voice, low, raspy, and oddly distorted. "Do you believe in second chances?" it asked. "What?" I replied, confused. "Who is this?" There was a pause, followed by a whisper. "You'll find out soon enough." Then the line went dead. I shook it off as a prank call, but a sense of unease settled in my chest. I glanced around the office, suddenly hyper-aware of how isolated I was. The shadows cast by the fluorescent lights seemed darker, deeper. Shrugging it off, I buried myself back in my work. At 11 p.m., the lights flickered. Not once, not twice, but 3 times in quick succession. I stared at the ceiling, my heart pounding. A power outage on New Year's Eve? Just my luck. But the lights didn't go out entirely. They just dimmed, casting the room in a sickly pale glow. Then came the sound. It was faint at first, like the rustle of paper or the scuttle of a small animal. But it grew louder, more distinct. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps echoing down the hallway. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. "Is someone there?" No response. The footsteps stopped abruptly, as if whoever or whatever was out there had frozen in place. I grabbed the nearest thing I could use as a weapon, which happened to be a heavy stapler, and tiptoed to the door. Peering out into the hallway, I saw nothing. Just the same sterile corridor, empty and lifeless. I'd almost convinced myself I was imagining things when my phone buzzed again. Another call from the same unknown number. This time I didn't answer. Instead, I stared at the screen, my breath shallow. The buzzing stopped, only to be replaced by a notification, a new voicemail. With trembling hands, I played it. The same distorted voice came through, but now it was laughing, a deep, guttural sound that made my skin crawl. "Tick-tock," it said. "Time's almost up." A chill ran down my spine. I checked the time. 11:30 p.m. Half an hour until midnight. What did they mean by "time's almost up"? Determined to get out of the building, I grabbed my coat and headed for the elevator. But when I pressed the button, nothing happened. The display read, "Out of service." Fine. I'd take the stairs. As I descended, the air grew colder. By the time I reached the ground floor, I could see my breath. The lobby was eerily dark, the usual hum of the vending machines and security monitors absent. And then I saw it. A single red balloon floating in the center of the room. My heart raced as I approached it. Attached to the balloon was a note, scrawled in jagged handwriting. "Do you believe in second chances now?" I backed away, my instincts screaming at me to leave. But as I turned to the exit, the doors wouldn't budge. I pushed, pulled, even kicked them, but they were locked tight. Panic set in as I realized my phone had no signal. I was trapped. The footsteps returned, louder this time, echoing from every direction. I spun around, clutching the stapler like it was a lifeline. "Who's there?" I shouted. "What do you want from me?" Silence. Then, from the shadows, a figure emerged, tall and cloaked in darkness, its face obscured. But its eyes, those piercing, glowing eyes, burned into mine. "You don't remember me, do you?" the figure said, its voice the same distorted rasp from the calls. I shook my head, fear rendering me speechless. New Year's Eve, 5 years ago. The accident, the one you walked away from. Memories came flooding back. A snowy road, the screech of tires, shattered glass. I'd been drunk, reckless, and lucky to survive. The other car, I'd never stopped to check. "You," I whispered. "You can't be." "Dead?" it hissed, stepping closer. "No thanks to you. And now it's your turn to pay." I stumbled backward, my mind racing. Was this some kind of twisted hallucination? Or was I truly facing the ghost of my past? The figure raised a hand, and the air grew impossibly cold. Shadows swirled around me, pulling me down into darkness. When I woke up, it was morning. The building was empty, and the doors were unlocked. My phone lay beside me, the screen cracked but functional. I checked the time. 8 a.m. The report I'd been working on was gone, as if I'd never been there at all. But the red balloon was still there, floating silently in the corner, a reminder that some debts can never truly be repaid. The clock ticked steadily toward midnight, marking the end of the year. For most, New Year's Eve is a time of celebration, but for me, it's the day I'll never forget. It started innocently enough, a small gathering with friends at a secluded cabin deep in the woods. I should have known something was off the moment we arrived. The cabin belonged to my college buddy Jake. "It's been in the family for decades," he'd said with a grin. The place was charming but old, with creaky floorboards and windows that let in the icy winter drafts. A perfect setting for an intimate party, I thought. But there was something unsettling about how the trees seemed to huddle too close, their skeletal branches clawing at the roof like they wanted in. By 10 p.m., the cabin was alive with laughter and the clink of glasses. The snowstorm outside intensified, blanketing the world in white and cutting us off from any chance of leaving. No one minded. We had enough food, booze, and firewood to last the night. As the hours ticked by, we began sharing stories. Ghost tales, urban legends, and personal experiences that sent shivers down our spines. Then Jake spoke up. "This cabin has its own story," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. The room fell silent. He told us about the Watcher of the Woods, a figure local legends claimed prowled the forest on New Year's Eve. "They say it's drawn to noise and light," Jake explained, his face illuminated by the flickering firelight. "It's harmless as long as you don't invite it in." He grinned, but the unease in his eyes betrayed him. We all laughed nervously, brushing it off as a good story to match the atmosphere. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, a prickling at the back of my neck that no amount of warmth from the fire could chase away. Around 11:30, the power went out. The cabin plunged into darkness, and the temperature seemed to drop instantly. "Relax," Jake said, pulling out a lantern. "The generator's old. I'll fix it." He and a couple of others headed outside, leaving the rest of us to huddle in the flickering glow of candles and the fireplace. That's when I heard it, a faint tapping at the window. I froze. It wasn't the wind. The pattern was deliberate, almost like a knock. The others heard it too, their chatter fading into tense silence. I forced myself to look, but all I saw was darkness pressing against the glass. "Probably a branch," someone muttered, but their voice wavered. Then the tapping moved to the front door, louder this time. "Jake?" one of the girls called out, her voice trembling. No response. The knocking grew insistent, almost angry. I'd never felt such dread, a visceral certainty that whatever was on the other side of that door wasn't Jake. "Don't open it," I said, my voice firmer than I felt. Everyone nodded, huddling closer together. The door rattled violently as if something was trying to force its way in. Then it stopped. We held our breath, listening to the howling wind. Minutes passed. Jake and the others hadn't returned. Against my better judgment, I decided to check. Armed with a flashlight, I stepped out into the storm. The snow swallowed my boots, and the icy wind cut through my jacket like knives. "Jake?" I shouted, my voice barely audible over the storm. I saw footprints leading toward the shed where the generator was housed. Following them, I found the shed door ajar, swinging on its hinges. Inside, the generator hummed quietly, but Jake and the others were gone. That's when I noticed the footprints leading away from the shed. They weren't human. Large, clawed imprints trailed off into the woods. My heart pounded as I shone the flashlight around, catching a glimpse of something, a hunched, shadowy figure darting between the trees. I bolted back to the cabin, slamming the door behind me. "We have to stay inside," I gasped, locking every door and window. The others didn't argue. They'd heard the footsteps circling the cabin, the crunch of snow under heavy weight. Midnight approached, and the atmosphere grew suffocating. The figure outside was relentless, its presence palpable as it circled, tapped, and knocked. Suddenly, the noise stopped, replaced by a chilling silence. The clock struck 12. We exhaled in relief, but it was short-lived. A single knock echoed through the cabin, followed by the sound of a door creaking open. My blood ran cold. One of us had forgotten to lock the back door. In the dim light, we saw it. A grotesque figure with hollow eyes and elongated limbs stood in the doorway, its head tilting unnaturally as it took a step inside. The candles flickered and went out, plunging us into darkness. Panic erupted. People screamed, stumbling in the dark. I grabbed the fire poker, swinging blindly. I felt resistance, heard an inhuman screech. The thing, whatever it was, retreated, slamming the door shut behind it. When the power returned minutes later, the cabin was eerily quiet. Jake and the others were still missing. Their footprints in the snow led deep into the woods, but never returned. We left the cabin as soon as the storm let up, vowing never to speak of that night again. But even now, I can't escape the memory of those hollow eyes and the sound of the knocking that haunts my dreams every New Year's Eve. And sometimes, when the wind is just right, I swear I hear it again.